From Thomas Edison State University, this is Edison Soundstage.
Welcome to the DEIC Studio, brought to you by the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council of Thomas Edison State University and the New Jersey State Library. Here we aim to create a safe space that generates dialogue and engagement to cultivate a diverse, equitable, and inclusive culture in our communities.
Thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Hancock, and to everyone, good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here for today's presentation. I'm Dr. Tara Kent, and I'm an Associate Dean in the Haven School of Art, Science, and Technology, and the Director of Undergraduate Education. Along with Angela Chapman, I co-chair the Events Committee of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council, and we work with a highly talented and dedicated group of colleagues. The council was charged by the university president to generate dialogue and engagement regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion among the members of the Thomas Edison, New Jersey State Library community. The council develops recommendations for training, policies, and practices that foster a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive culture for the community. We promote educational and personal development programs to further the mission of the council, promote the use of assessment to evaluate and monitor DEI needs, and makes recommendations for changes that promote diversity, equity, and inclusion. To learn more about these many initiatives of the council, please visit the DEI portal on the university website. Today, we're pleased to present this program titled Understanding Others, featuring one of our own mentors, Dr. Jamie Franco-Zamudio. Dr. Franco-Zamudio is an associate professor at the JFK School of Psychology at National University and a Thomas Edison State University mentor in psychology. She developed Thomas Edison's first course in the psychology of gender. Dr. Franco-Zamudio is dedicated to teaching for social responsibility, developing course content intended to nurture her students' sense of responsibility, and her work also encourages advocacy. She's received numerous awards for her teaching and service, including the Innovative Teaching Award and the Distinguished Service Award from the Society of the Psychological Study of Social Issues. Her research has been funded by the Ford Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, and the Alabama Department of Public Health. She earned her bachelor's at the Ohio State University and her master's and PhD from the University of California at Santa Cruz. She has served on the governing boards of Triangle Speakers, Hope Boxing Academy, Lifelines Counseling Services, and Prism United. She served as a professor of psychology at Spring Hill College for 12 years. We feel very fortunate to have her a part of our community and to welcome her today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Franco-Zamudio.
Thank you. I wanted to thank you all, Dr. Hancock, Dr. Kent, everyone who invited me to speak today. It means a great deal to me. I've been talking about and sharing the psychological research related to diversity and inclusion since 2005 when I was a graduate student. And I became interested in the topic because of my own experiences, especially with aspects of perspective taking and understanding the lived experience of people from different groups. A lot of the time people questioned me growing up and said things like, "What are you?" Like, what am I? How do I identify, do you mean? And so I learned really early on to have difficult conversations and have discovered that the aspect of diversity and inclusion is something that is very personal to all of us, but can translate really well to the workplace. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And we decided to title this Understanding Others. Thank you, Dr. Kent, for that, because really trying to understand the experience of others is important in the workplace, especially when we're framing our group dynamics, how we norm our behaviors in groups, how we interact with others, share our, well, actually, I should say, do the balance, the delicate balance of sharing our lives and ourselves with people in the workplace, right? We do a lot of what people will call identity negotiation, basically shifting who we are in different settings. Some people call this code switching. So I was pleased to see that this is an important topic for the university. And here is your own statement on diversity, equity, and inclusion. More recently, people have added the J in front of it. And as a Star Wars fan, I like the fact that it's Jedi, but that's justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the justice adds a bit more around the social change, right? And thinking of ourselves as change agents. What can we each do on an interpersonal level, on an individual level, and then on a societal or structural level? So the goals here at Thomas Edison State University are to accept, respect, and appreciate all of the differences among us. And some people will say it's easier said than done, right? So to accept and respect and appreciate, we also have to be aware and conscious of people's lived experiences and how they might differ from our own. In terms of equity, being committed to organizational policies that support fair treatment and advancement for all people. This is really important when we think about equity versus equality, right? And so really understanding that different people with different experiences and needs might need different organizational policies. And so we'll talk about that a little bit later. And then of course, inclusion. These are deliberate strategic efforts to make people feel like they belong so that they're supported and included. And that encompasses both our social demographics, like who we are, what our background is, how we identify, and then also our role identities, like what our job is in the organization, or in this case, the university. And so belonging and being included in decision-making is difficult when people have identities that are often marginalized, oppressed, stigmatized, and devalued. Occasionally there is difficulty speaking up and having what we would call minority dissent or challenging existing systems, especially when people believe that the system is legitimate the way that it is. And so in thinking about defining this concept of diversity, I like to think of it as more of a verb rather than this, we're a diverse organization, right? So when you think about the action and the intention behind having a diverse and inclusive environment, thinking that each day you have to consciously attend to and be aware of and appreciate and practice all of the tools related to diversity and inclusion while doing your job, right? While making sure that you feel good and aren't overstressed, and what we like to call in psychology is cognitive load, right? We have a lot going on in our minds every day and all the things that we have to balance ourselves. And then being able to have empathy and think about the experience of others is quite difficult. But if we consciously practice it, each day, each setting, each new place we enter, it gets easier. And it becomes part of, like they say, a habit. Just keep practicing it and it will become part of who you are and what you do. But again, recognize each one of us, I'm sure that are here, are at different levels of understanding. So sometimes people will say, oh, you're an expert, or I've reached expert level of understanding intercultural differences or cultural competency. But I like to think that no one is ever really an expert because it's always changing too. You might have heard the term social construction, that identities, experiences are constructed in a particular time based on your generation, based on your social setting or where you live, and what people do and practice in those different settings. And so when we think about the social construction of identities, it's always going to change. And a lot of the time people are asking questions about gender, which I was really pleased and excited to share around gender, the different ways of thinking outside of the binary, or these sort of dichotomous identities, and even beyond a spectrum, but thinking about how people identify and what feels right for them. Sometimes what we would call aschematic or undifferentiated. It's just, I don't like to think of gender as a guiding source for who I am. And that can relate to any identity. And so for some people that might be difficult because for themselves, it's like, oh, that's a huge part of who I am and the things that I do. But for someone else, it might not be. And this becomes really difficult to understand different experiences and different wants and needs. But we'll talk in a minute about how to do that. And that is pretty much to decenter yourself, to take your perspective, your way of thinking out of the picture and just listen and understand someone else's. Again, easier said than done, right? Knowing when we think about diversity too, that there's different ways of being and different ways of knowing. What you might know, what you might call common sense, what you might experience every day and see as, you know, capital T truth is not the same for someone else. And then here's the big part. And what we can do as an organization is think about institutional discrimination, systemic privilege. Who in which setting is the quote unquote norm? So what are our policies and procedures, ways of talking, speaking, doing meetings? All of that is normed around a particular type of person, right? Whoever that person may be. And understanding that it's different. I've been in board meetings before where it's like, we decided not to do a hierarchical board. We decided to figure out a way to do things around meals and discussions rather than Robert's Rules of Order. So if that works in a space or setting, then alter the space and setting. So always being open for that. And of course, building alliances and working together to, to fight against different forms of discrimination. And so why does this matter? How does this contribute to success? Well, some people might ask you, why should I care about diversity and inclusion? Well, one of the main things that the research has shown is that it encourages innovation and creativity, and especially in the workplace and especially in universities, we want to keep growing and we want to keep understanding new ways of doing things. People will talk about too, like re-envisioning history from a different perspective. All of these things are really important. And when we have people who are together, who have groupthink, these symptoms here by Irving Janis, there's a lot of pressure to conform when you're in a group. If you don't put in things like, let's brainstorm, maybe in writing, or let's assign this person the role of devil's advocate to say what potentially is wrong with that thought, idea, way of doing things, or plan. And that way that person's not ostracized for themselves personally. They've taken that on as a role, and they're there to stop any pressure on people who have differing opinions or dissenters. They're there to encourage people to stop self-censoring and to feel comfortable to say and share what they feel. This belief that your group and your ideas are better than any other group or idea is a common thing. We call that, the us versus them. It's what we, as in psychology, talk about the in-group and the out-group. We just automatically love our in-group. It's just something that we do. And that's a good thing to feel good about ourselves. But the unfortunate byproduct is that we see outsiders in a deficient way. And so we have to think of ways too to encourage this sort of larger identity together. And so you might think of different departments on campus or different programs on campus. And suddenly you've got ours is better than yours, or we do it this way. But if you can think of yourself as one member of this larger university, then you start to have more positive views towards each other. And so again, it's important for things like recruiting, hiring, working in diverse teams, collaborating with others, and of course, targeting diverse populations when you're thinking about students or hiring again. So one of the things that I wanted to do is point out a friend of mine, Joelle Lewis-Billingsley, and I came up with these 3 A's of inclusion. And so when we think about these different ways of engaging in inclusive practices, there's some steps. So first, kind of analyze your own identity and who you are and how you see the world around you. Then work to actively accept others and include others and act in ways that work individually to be more inclusive, interpersonally, in groups, in the community, and then if you can, and you have the power to, in the larger system, right? Change policies if you can. So here today, we can't do all of this, of course, but thinking about who we are and how we interact with others and developing our own knowledge base, becoming self-aware and aware of others is a good first step. And so thinking about empathy, caring for others, doing perspective taking, which is trying to see their perspective in order for ourselves to grow and transform, but then also to be able to meet the needs of others. And so, of course, I welcome any questions that you have. I'll probably be speaking for another 10 or 15 minutes maximum, and then we'll engage in some conversation, I hope. So when we think about interpreting the environment around us, one of the things that's really important to consider is that we all perceive the world around us differently, right? You can watch movies like there's one called Vantage Point, in which people from different spaces see an event happen and describe it differently. But think beyond just being in a different location and seeing something from a different view, but think about how you might view something that's going on around or a situation based on your different needs. What do you want to see? What do you need to see? What are the things that you're focusing on? What are your motives? What are some existing beliefs or prejudices? Is something personally relevant to you? And if not, you may not even be paying attention to it. So someone might say, do you remember when this happened? No, I really don't. I wasn't paying attention. My selective attention was on something else. And then, of course, there's certain aspects of a person or an object, like the size, the contrast in terms of color from a background, noise level, things will just automatically stand out to us. And so as we're thinking about perceiving the world in a particular way, we have to then think about how others perceive it based on their own needs and experiences. And so as you're doing this perspective taking, you're in a group. One of the things I like to talk about is just something as simple as personality and intergroup conversation. So you're trying to get something done, a task done, and you have this person who's a know-it-all, we would call them, right? Someone who's just consistently asserting their beliefs and sharing. What you want to do is understand what's their need. They need to be heard. Then what you want to do is recognize them and then offer up, why don't you write down everything? We'll read and pay attention to it, but let's hear from everyone else. If someone is a quote unquote yes person, then what is their need? Their need is to be liked. Their need is to be affirmed and to, avoid conflict potentially. So how can you then think about adjusting the situation so that they feel comfortable talking, right? So in these different settings, by being able to understand someone's perspective, then we're able to adjust how we act and how we work together. And so, of course, when we're thinking about engaging in perspective taking, we have to consider our own thoughts and our own understanding, and then theirs, compare and contrast your own beliefs. And so sometimes too, there's things like what we attribute the cause of someone's behavior to, right? And so when we're thinking about trying to explain why someone might do something, if we're thinking from our own perspective, we're thinking, I would never talk that loudly. But maybe culturally, that's the way that a person is comfortable engaging or talking at that level. Or I like to do active discussions where I sort of interrupt people. That's what I grew up with. That might not be comfortable with people. And culturally, I found out recently that in some countries even, it was Sweden, I believe, where, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but where a pause is very important in dialogue for making a point, but people knew the person wasn't done speaking. And so just even our cultural practices in language, do you take time to pause, or do we immediately jump in and discuss? And we can imagine that when we are engaging in these conversations, we might actually make some mistakes in our interpretation. And it's important to just open up the conversation around how are you comfortable working? How are you comfortable being addressed? How are you comfortable speaking about these kinds of things? I do see a typo here, I apologize. But when is perspective taking useful? And so again, it's when you've joined a group, you could be an ally, you could be a member of the group, when people are working on a project and have different approaches. If someone states something that you said or did that was harmful to them, that's really useful. And again, when that happens, you don't necessarily want to center yourself, right? You don't want to be the center, and the term again is decenter. You want to think about centering their experience. So I'm going to take my own feelings, my own hurt, my own offense at them telling me that I harmed them or did something hurtful when I didn't intend to, and think about what they're experiencing and what they perceived. Be patient, take time, listen, and then offer up an explanation and offer an apology, and step in and be willing to grow and change, and to identify that maybe that wasn't the intention, but it's how it's being perceived. And it is okay to make mistakes. People will do it. I do it all the time. I did it just last night in a class. We misgender. We might point out someone's race and ethnicity, and it might be incorrect. We might make assumptions around people's sexual orientation. There's all kinds of things that we can do. Catch yourself, take a moment, apologize, and say you'll work to do better next time. And that's all you really need to do. Not make it about yourself and have them have to apologize for making you feel bad about it. That's when people will shut down and self-censor. Some ways to apply perspective taking, you can ask permission, ask someone to, kind of reflect back. Does this sound correct? I imagine you might have felt this way. Is that right? Imagine yourself in that person's place having a similar experience. Might not be exactly the same, but you might have had similar emotions around a setting, or you might have been misinterpreted. And then think about a time when you might have had similar situations and felt the same way. Just mentioned that earlier. And then also thinking about different cultures, heritages, and lived experiences that are different than your own. There's so many resources out there. There's an amazing list of TED Talks. There's great videos on YouTube. There's a lot of different agencies and organizations that provide an understanding from the person's point of view of what it's like to live in a culture, to live with a psychological disorder, to work in a particular team or setting. And so when you watch those, it will help you to see one perspective, but again, not making an assumption that it generalizes to everyone of that culture or heritage or experience. And so when someone tells you about their experience, let's just say you're thinking, oh, I don't think that was meant to exclude anyone, this policy, this action, something that was said. But that person's reality is that it did affect them. And the more people are treated in a way that feels like rejection, the more sensitive you become to it. And so something could be completely ambiguous. It could be something that was just a facial expression, right? So something like me squinting my forehead could be like this, oh, is that microaggression? Like, is that person feeling upset towards me? Are they angry? What is that? But it could just be me needing a better prescription for my glasses, right? But if you've had many experiences in which people have treated you in a particular way, you're going to take that information or that face or that word that someone used, and it's going to feel negative to you. And so you want to validate that experience. You want to give legitimacy to someone's feelings and not try and explain it differently to them. Because whatever they are experiencing is truth to them. That is different than maybe what you're seeing as this, if we can call it objective truth. So if someone works at work, trusts you, sees you as an ally, it's really important to make sure to continue to validate them. And when you're thinking about what that validation can look like, you can thank someone for sharing, you can thank them for trusting you with information, ask them what they would like for you to do in the future, if anything. Again, we don't want to speak for people, but I like this term when people say amplifying someone else's voice or experience if people aren't listening to them. Actively listen, ask clarifying questions, center your responses on their needs, right? So that's the decentering aspect. And then don't try to console or diminish what they had experienced or explained to them, just like I mentioned before. This will affect them in feeling that they can talk up in the future or speak up in the future. And so one of the things I wanted to point to, a lot of the times we talk about race and ethnicity, gender, but we rarely bring in this whole full spectrum of identities. And it might be difficult to see, but I believe we're sharing these slides later. But when you think about our identities, the groups that we belong to, there's so many different ones, right? Religion, nationality, language, disability, so many different aspects of who we are. And then with intersectionality, I encourage you to watch a TED Talk by Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term. She was talking about it from a legal perspective when there weren't policies in place to support people who had the intersections of multiple identities. Right? So maybe there was a policy around race and there was a policy around gender, but what about someone who needed something to a policy or a law to cover the intersection of their specific experience of having a particular race and ethnicity and gender? So being a woman of color might have required different policies, protections, et cetera. And so that's important to think about, that the different ways in which we experience the world around us and our needs are going to differ based on the intersections of these different identities. And you can see here, there's so many different aspects of identities, from what's central to ourselves and the core of how we define who we are, to our expectations across these larger systems that have an impact on who we are. And so if you can imagine being someone who's marginalized or stigmatized and has multiple identities that are marginalized or stigmatized, discriminated against, and you're moving within different systems, when you're at school, when you're at work, when you're working in a larger industry, maybe a conference or a training, when you're out in the larger world, you might shift who you are in all of these different settings. And again, that takes a lot of your mental energy to figure out where it's safe to go, how you should present yourself and monitor yourself in certain settings in order to be valued, accepted, and heard. That takes a great deal of energy. And so while we're still figuring out ourselves, it's important to also consider what other people might be going through and how that might be for them. And so I just wanted to share this with you. This is, I had students list all of their different identities and how they interacted. And different people had different identities that were important to them. This top left-hand corner, this person identified purely based on their race and ethnicity. And other people didn't even come up that for them. So different identities were important to them in different ways. And so just this example, this participant identified as Asian American when in the larger culture that was at a predominantly white institution, Chinese when they were with their family, Japanese when they were with their other side of the family, and when the two families together, they identified as Asian. So that's really complex, right? And so how do you know then to label, address, introduce someone? It's going to be really complex even for them. It might even change in different ways how they see themselves. And each one of these identities guides what we might wear, how we might act, how we might speak. And so when we're drawing upon our identities to move throughout the world, you can imagine that it's important to know what's central to someone. But on the outside, you might be labeling them, this person didn't even identify something like gender, religion, all those other identities. And so we might make these assumptions and not really know, and it might not be important to them in terms of how they live and move throughout the world. So it's just a quick thought. How do you describe people to others? What kind of things do you focus on when you're describing someone? What are your interactions like when you communicate with people that you believe are similar or maybe different than you? What types of norms, scripts, or like behaviors do we see on average people doing, acting like in groups that we belong to or in groups that we don't belong to? And then how does this relate to the workplace? So just kind of think about those. One of the things that's important to point out is that, of course, we're really good at going beyond just verbal communication and looking at nonverbal communication and making assumptions around whether someone's making eye contact or not, or gestures, how they pause, like I mentioned before, their intonation in saying things. And so sometimes when we misinterpret these things, we can have confusion, tension, embarrassment, frustration. All of these things can occur. And so again, that's when it's really important to feel comfortable and to open up spaces where people are comfortable to clarify. And so thinking about the different strategies, you want to become aware and strengthen your knowledge around different cultural experiences and identities and the changing demographics. Be flexible respect others, attempt to be empathetic and engage in perspective taking. And all of this is going to require a lot of different skills. And so some of the things that I practice are just, I have here in terms of language development, thinking about the toolbox of questions. If someone says something I think is offensive, I might say, what did you mean by that? Or can you explain that further? And then that way I get a better understanding before reacting. In terms of leadership development, when someone is, you're an ally to a group, or an accomplice, which is terminology we can discuss, you want to make sure to step in when you can in order to avoid any hurt or harm to someone else. And of course, there's this model, which I really like to work from. It's the model of respect as an acronym. And so there's all kinds of things that you can do in order to engage successfully with others and to be inclusive. And so that is all I have for you.
Thank you very much. That was a very thoughtful presentation. I am Jen Hoff. I'm General Counsel, and I'm here today to host the question and answer. And I know that Dr. Franco-Zamudio has lots of answers because we've already heard some, and I'm excited to hear some others. So if at this time anyone wants to ask a question, provide a comment, share an experience, I would be happy to take a look at those. And I know that ultimately, you don't care what I'm looking at, you care what Dr. Franco-Zamudio is looking at. And do you prefer to be called Dr. Franco-Zamudio or Jamie?
Jamie is great.
Okay, great. I'm going to start off with a question that we have. You just talked a little bit about being allies and conspirators and advocates. What exactly do you mean by that, and what are the differences?
That's a great question. There's a lot of really great TED Talks out there, conference talks that you can find on video, papers that people have written around the terminology. And ally used to be the term that we used all the time. And then some people became a little bit more critical of what does it mean to be an ally and is it enough? And so depending upon the person, they're going to use terms like accomplice, advocate, co-conspirator differently than an ally. And basically that means that allyship really calls for you to gain an understanding. It calls potentially for you to support. And when it comes to taking action, it could encompass some of your actions on an interpersonal level, maybe even an institutional level. What happens in the critique sometimes is that allies have the opportunity, because they don't have a particular identity that's being discriminated against, they have an opportunity to step back. They have an opportunity to not be hurt by whatever is occurring that's hurting the person or the group that they're allying with. And so an accomplice, a co-conspirator, these people will actually get in the trenches and work to be able to make something happen. And it's going to be difficult, right? Change is slow. Being a change agent is slow. And so engaging in things that we like to call collective action for social change, when you're an accomplice, you're in there, you're doing it. And you might also end up having some repercussions, right? But you're willing to take that in order to see the change occur.
Thank you. Another question we have is, can you expand more on the respect process in communicating? I know that was one of your last slides. It looks very interesting and helpful. So if you could expand on that, that would be great.
Yes. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up the slide to talk about it. And I just wanted to be conscious of and aware of time. Whoops. Just trying to make a change. There we go. So I didn't want to get into it too much, but a lot of the time I'll go into organizations, hospitals, different places, and people want to know, what are the things that I should have in my mind when I'm doing decision making, right? So models like respect work really well. So when you're thinking about, okay, I need to make change, I feel like it's the time, I feel like these are some things that we need to do. What can I do? Or even, what does inclusion look like on a larger level? You want to have rapport, right? And so that is a lot that's related to connection, to conversation, to communication. It's also a bit about self-control. And so seeking the other person's point of view and developing that rapport also encompasses trust. So a lot of the times when we are working with people who are different from us and have different experiences, we have to first get that trust going. And then, of course, we're engaging in empathy. Once people are comfortable sharing their point of view, I'll tell you, there are many instances in which people will tell me, I will only tell you this because you also identify from this particular group that I come from. And I know that you're not going to take what I'm saying wrong because I haven't really fully developed how to talk about it. And so thinking about giving people a space to be trusted is so important for being able to engage in empathy and perspective taking. And then you want to provide support, right? You want to involve other people. You want to think about ways that you can support on an individual, but also an institutional level, and then reassure the person and come back to them and let them know you haven't forgotten. You're working on this. What do they think? What do they need? And so sometimes we come in, I'll call this like a savior complex, or we come in with this like patriarchal or noblesse oblige approach where I'm going to save you and take care of you. And that's not good either, right? And so we want to make sure that we support in ways, but we ask, how can I support you? And so engaging in partnership, you can do collaborations. There's all kinds of really great things that are going on there. Continue to keep checking for what is needed. Learn about cultural competence. And of course, as I mentioned before, the trust aspect, that's a thread throughout. And so these are, it's not a stage wise, it's just things to really think about when you are working on change, right? It's not just, I'm going to change a policy and everything's going to be great, right? It has to be thoughtful, appropriate, and instituted in a way that is valued. So, yeah.
What are your thoughts on how to recognize and celebrate individuals who invest in and grow in their DEI competencies? And this is in light of your comment that we are never an expert because there is always more to learn and understand. And that's, yes, that resonated with me as well.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really great question. And I started off as someone who actually, my research is an identity, and that came from people not knowing, again, as I mentioned, who I am. So I just started studying it. I originally was going to school for organizational psychology and business psychology, as you would call it. But I became really interested in this. And I ended up being asked to share what I knew about how people sort of default to different ways of thinking, right? And how then we can overcome these ways of thinking. And so you'll see that there are people who have this knowledge base in different disciplines across campus. And what you want to do is you want to invite them. A lot of the time we get chosen. So I kept getting chosen. You know, Jamie will come out and do this. Jamie will do this talk. Jamie will work with us on the marketing department. Jamie will work with us in the hospital. And so it's like, okay, but what about all the other people that have this knowledge and expertise? And how can we cultivate a group so that we don't end up with burnout, right? And a lot of the time, people that engage in this emotional work really burn out really, really fast. You all know that. And so what I would engage in is maybe like asking, what can we do? Can we develop teams? Can we give people opportunities to move in and out of teams if they're exhausted, right? So if you are someone who's a leader and you're thinking, I want to have a diversity, equity, and inclusion group on campus, and maybe we have some quote unquote fellows where there are professors who can teach about different topics and then go into other classes and teach on those topics. And then asking people what it is that they want and need. Sometimes people want awards, you know, they're motivated by being able to like share with someone else that I am capable. And that, as someone who is stigmatized in environments like business or academia, there's this book out there and this term presumed incompetent. So you can walk into a setting and people are just going to presume that you're incompetent. And so you need these awards behind your name. And other people are like, nah, I don't need an award. That's not what's motivating me. And so really, I think opening it up to what it is that people want. Do they want to do the work behind the scenes? Do they want to be someone who's out there speaking? Do they want to engage in research? And then to celebrate them, again, there's awards, but there's also just the thank you. A lot of the time, the work that we do is really important in terms of saying thank you. And then the next big thing is providing compensation, a stipend here and there, because you know it's extra work. If someone is taking on additional mentoring opportunities with students because the students feel comfortable going to them, we'll then find a way to support them that way too. So it's not in addition to the work that they do. So yeah, I think that there's so much that can be done, but asking the larger community to share and to feel comfortable sharing what they might want and need in order to be valued for their focus on DEI would be great.
Thank you. We have another question. How do you respond to people who believe that, and I'm going to use it because I'm a Star Wars fan too, Jedi work perpetuates division amongst race, ethnicity, class, any types of sort of identities?
Mm-hmm. So that, again, great question. People want to engage in what people have called being colorblind, and that could be applied to many different identities. And so can we all just assimilate in some way and have a shared way of being? But Marilyn Brewer is a researcher who came up with this really great term, and she calls it optimal distinctiveness. People have an optimal level of being distinct and different from others, right? We want to be similar enough that we're not ostracized and kicked out of a group or marginalized, but different enough that we're special, right? And so we like to be special. We like to have aspects of our culture and traditions and all of these things celebrated. And that's one of the things that we forget, is that it's not always about remediation or fixing the negative and restitution and things like that, but it's also about celebrating. And I think people are really comfortable with that. We see a lot of, International Heritage Days and those kinds of things, but also it's beyond the tradition. It's the way of knowing and experiencing the world around them. And so it doesn't have to be divisive. It can be shared, but then you get into, is it cultural appropriation? Is it, so there's a lot of issues there. If you can just think of having a conversation with this person, if someone is saying, why do we always have to point out that, and someone said that to me, I just see you as a white person. Why do you always have to point out that you're indigenous and Chicano or Mexican American? Like, because I love it. It's part of me. It's huge. It's great. And I think you might be feeling like you're complimenting me because you're saying you just see me similar to you, and that's okay. But I need you to know that it's important for you to maybe learn a little bit about how I see the world. And so that is that part of sharing culturally and understanding that maybe you can focus on. And part of the celebration, then you could also bring in, there's another aspect too. And this is where you can really help people to continue to feel celebrated, right? So I don't know if that helps in any way. I could go on forever about that.
Thank you. You speak a lot about having these important conversations, and they are incredibly important to any organization or group. But how do you balance these important organizations with the actual substance of the work that an organization has to get done?
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's so important. So one of the things you want to do is create, like I mentioned before, people who are taking on that role of ensuring things are not forgotten, right? And so sometimes we'll talk about that. Are you compliant, right? Compliance. But beyond that, also thinking about how people are also recognized, right? And again, not just for their background demographics, right? But for the different roles that they play in their own lives and how they're trying to balance their own lives and what's going on. And so the best thing to possibly do is to think about the spaces in which you're going to suspend something, right? So a good example is I have a friend who has certain religious beliefs around animal testing and environmental issues, but that aspect of her life has to be suspended in her beliefs when she's doing medical trials in the lab. It's just, this is the way that things happen. This is the way that they occur. This is the way that we make progress in this setting. Can you rectify that within yourself? And some people will say, no, I can't. And so they'll go into a different career, a different job, et cetera. But if we can find a way to say, I value what it is that you're thinking and feeling, I respect the fact that you are suspending that while we're working on this, then that's great. And just in an everyday setting, you can imagine that, yes, we're going to focus on this particular task in this particular moment and get this done. We're not forgetting about all those other things. And this is when we're going to attend to those things. But in that setting, someone might say, this way of working isn't working for me. Give people an opportunity to, maybe a one-on-one later to negotiate whether that is important to, make some change in how the team works in that setting. If you are someone who is marginalized or who has a quote unquote stigmatized identity, it's in your mind all the time, right? It's how you move throughout the world. You know this. And so you're aware of what other people will think. And so I think that it's important to, to just have conversations around those things.
Okay, that makes sense. I'm reading the next question. As TESU plans more events and announcements, and we expand our media presence, how do we make sure that our coworkers, our community is appropriately represented, but at the same time not marginalized, not tokenized?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. I actually had to create a brochure when I was a graduate student for our grad programs. And one of the pictures, it was like, okay, well, I want to make sure all of the different groups are represented in this picture. I've even seen online where people have cut and pasted individuals into these pictures to show the diversity. Well, it's important because if you don't see diversity in a picture or in the descriptions talking about, saying you're an equal opportunity employer, or you value this way of thinking, or you value diversity. If you don't have that, then people won't even apply to go to the school or to work there. So it's really important to have that initial recognition of diversity. But then what needs to happen is that while you're trying to create this impression, it needs to be real and it needs to be true. Otherwise, it's going to backfire. So when you're engaging in the marketing, make sure that you have people on the team who are diverse. From many different backgrounds. And that way someone might see something and say, I think you could approach it this way, or I think that might be misinterpreted. And so not only having the representation in what you're putting out there, but who's working behind the scenes to consistently provide a check and balance.
Thank you. In focusing outside of the TESU community, we've witnessed an increase in hate crimes in the last few years, actually more than the last few years. What do you think might help address this growingly alarming problem?
Yes, I think what's ended up happening is that the norms around what we do and what we say have really changed. And people say that could be due to social media, that could be due to people becoming more aware, the globalization of the world, all of these different things. And so we are in a space now where people say, I just want to be real. I want to be honest. Or what I think and feel is valid. And so that's good, but then it can have these detrimental effects too. And as I was mentioning before with the us versus them, what ends up happening occasionally is that you see some people in your in-group, part of the groups that you belong to, as being morally righteous, right? And you're including them in all of the things that you believe they should have. They should be supported, respected, given certain things, provided with certain things, treated in a just and fair way. If someone is outside of your group, if you're seeing them in a way that they're deficient in some way, you might morally exclude them and don't see them as deserving of certain things. And that is when it becomes very difficult, right? You start to dehumanize. You see people in ways that you feel like they're deserving of bad treatment, right? And that becomes a huge problem. And so what you want to do is find ways to make it more apparent, more visible, more visual, that everyone is valued. But again, coming from a top-down policy, we even look at our immigration policies and you'll see, what's the quota and what's the quota based on? There's good immigrants and there's not so good immigrants, right? And so if you're valuing people based on contributions, roles, where they come from this policy level, that then justifies and makes legitimate people's beliefs that someone is better or worse than someone else. And then especially when you pit people against each other in terms of scarce resources, right? And especially in times of, economic downturn or pandemic or all of these things, then people feel it's justified to have these feelings and to want to remove those other people. That's a huge issue. So I always say, you have to start from the top and find some way to, provide equal status, equal support for everyone.
Thank you. You also talked about in your presentation about hiring from a diverse background, which is a very good goal. How do you legitimately find the quality and diverse audience that you're looking for in order to do that?
This is huge, right? This is a really big thing when it comes to hiring and recruiting. First of all, just like you were talking about with marketing, people need to look at your job ad and say, or even students coming to the college saying, I belong there, right? What are the types of things that people study? What are the types of things that people put in place in terms of programs? If you see there's one diversity and inclusion officer and that's it, and maybe they have one web page and it's not infused throughout the entire college, then you might get people self-selecting out of that. So what you want to do is present a space and create a space in which inclusive practices, knowledge, all of these things are part of your organization. And then people will feel comfortable entering these spaces, applying for these jobs. Then you also have to think, we have this backlash from affirmative action from ages ago when people felt that particular quotas were put in place that were unfair. And so when you say, well, I'd like to hire this person, these two people are equal in all other ways, they both could contribute, but this person provides diversity, that might seem objectively true that these two people are equal in some way, but people can always rationalize why someone else might be better. And we tend to like people who are similar to us. We tend to think, oh, they're probably going to like it here more. We'll come up with all kinds of reasons. Oh, look, they study this thing. You'll make justifications. And so we have to remember too, as gatekeepers, that we have to check our beliefs and expectations. So not only is there the self-selection, but there's these gatekeepers in place. And so having someone who's in charge of the DEI office who works with faculty to be able to share strategies that are best practices across a lot of universities. And there's tons of information out there on that. But again, the faculty in that department are the ones that hire, or the staff, a member or the supervisor. And so there are certain people who are going to need additional support in terms of opening up their views around this. And just telling people, avoid groupthink, right? We want to be innovative and creative. The more people we have that are diverse and different, that are comfortable speaking out, the better the university will be.
And how is it that, sorry, let me read this question a bit better, because how is it that you would go about advising the Diversity Council at Thomas Edison to continue the work? What's the one piece of advice you would have?
Oh, so I'm going to say this, a multi-pronged approach, right? You want to be able to give people the opportunity. People love to have autonomy and change in their workplace, right? We know this. We don't want to be bored. We want to feel like we're contributing something. And so by appointing different people, different things based on their interests. So if someone's really interested in policies, have someone go through maybe with a team of a couple people, maybe involve students. You've got your shared governance, but looking at the different policies on campus. What is your policy around lived names, right? And some people call them preferred names or even preferred programs, but lived is even better. It's not a preference, it's who you are. And so on my school in Mobile, Alabama, we created a policy and changed the way that across the campus people were identifying, and we found ways to change in the databases so they all sort of spoke to each other. Other people might be engaged in awareness and dialogues on campus. That might be their thing. Other people might be more behind the scenes in terms of doing research on certain topics, looking at the syllabi across all of the classes and seeing, do we have diversity in thought and who we're citing? So I would say just taking a big look at all of the things that you want to focus on, or that people might say they want to focus on, and then putting one person in charge of each of those.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question, a little off topic before we close. You mentioned earlier that you identify yourself as a Star Wars fan. What is your favorite movie of, well, the main 9? I certainly have a very strong opinion on this, but we would like to hear from you.
So 1978, I went to the Cinerama Dome down in California, this huge one, and saw the first Star Wars movie. Absolutely my favorite one because of the memories with family. But I will say The Empire Strikes Back. I'm an old school Star Wars. I've seen, I've seen all these other ones. But sci-fi is something that I absolutely love. And in fact, love Star Trek too, because of the original thought behind why they did it, right? So a lot of the time we're talking about social justice and identity and inclusion and all of those things. Some of the greatest examples of people getting along who are different can happen in sci-fi movies, can happen in music, can happen in poetry and in art in so many different ways. And so, yeah, I value that. And plus it's fun.
Yes. You certainly had the right answer, in my opinion, on the Star Wars movie. You chose correctly. You chose wisely.
Thank you.
That is all the time we have for the question and answers. Thank you so much, Jamie. I'm going to throw it now to Angela Chapman. Thank you.
Thanks for having me here.
Thanks, Jen. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Angela Chapman, the Acting External Affairs Manager and a proud member of the DEI Council. We are excited about our work to create a more diverse, inclusive, and equitable university environment. On behalf of the DEI Council, we would like to thank Dr. Jamie Franco-Zamudio for her time today and providing us with an outstanding and valuable presentation on understanding others. You gave us a lot to think about. We do have an upcoming DI speaker series on June 16th with Dr. Clyde Ledbetter, Juneteenth, a celebration for resistance, and another series on August 17th with Dr. Diana Sanchez and Dr. Julie Garcia to discuss implicit bias and microaggressions. You can register for both events on the Capitol Campus website through the TESU events page. Thank you everyone for participating and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.